I would also want you all to interact and participate with any questions you may have as we go through the process for the next 25 or 30 minutes or so. By way of brief introduction, Dr. Tim Brennan, to my left, is from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and we are very happy to have you with us. Stuart Brotman is president of Stuart N. Brotman Communications, Lexington, Massachusetts, is here. And I should mention that Stuart recently got a very prestigious appointment as well to the advisory committee of the U.S. State Department's Committee on Communication and Information Policy. So a very nice appointment there as well. And with that, I'll just throw it out. Stuart, let you start. As you look at the top issues, the big issues when it comes to broadband nationally, and also maybe if you drill down a little bit to Indiana, what would those be?
Sure. Well, I think broadband is really a subset, as I indicated yesterday, of our economy, of our national priorities. And I think the closer that broadband is linked to those issues, probably the greater momentum we'll have both in the marketplace in terms of policy. And to the extent that we've sort of gotten off track since the National Broadband Plan has been released, although I think a lot of good has happened and there has been good momentum, I think politically the issue of our economy and domestic policy really hasn't been linked. When the broadband plan came out, I wrote an article for Business Week talking about its importance to job creation and job retraining and things that are so critical to economic development now, and that people would be able to understand and link very directly. And I don't think that linkage is quite there yet. And I think that's a gap that really needs to be filled in order for broadband to really have the sort of traction that I think a lot of us are expecting in this area.
Probably everybody in this room is more familiar with the National Broadband Plan than I am. So I speak with some hesitation, although as an industrial organization, economists were sort of given the attitude of thinking that we can pontificate about anything regardless of what we know. I guess a couple of things come to mind in terms of thinking about this. One is being clear we understand what the rationales are. I mean, there's I think Stuart said something about the economists making a line about the free lunch, but there's also a kind of a famous economist joke, economist line, which is two economists are walking down the street and one says, look, there's a $20 bill on the sidewalk, and the other one says, no, there can't be. The reason being is that had there been a $20 bill on the sidewalk, someone would have picked it up already. Which leads to the question of, are there $20 broadband bills lying around the sidewalk? If so, why haven't they been picked up? Now, to pose the question doesn't mean that there isn't an answer for it, but it may help understand what the justifications are for this, for these sorts of policies. Just to take an example, to take two examples. One is maybe the problem is that the willingness to pay for broadband in rural areas is less than what it costs to supply it because of low densities of users relative to making the cost higher per person. That in and of itself doesn't rationalize broadband subsidies or policies. What it might say is, well, maybe we should give people who live in those areas more money and then let them decide whether they want to spend it on broadband or whatever else they might also need because they're in those kinds of areas, and provide some sort of support that way. So that's the kind of thing that sort of comes to mind with that. There's a second issue in terms of measurement about this. I know there's a lot of people in Washington have been debating data on broadband penetration in the U.S. compared to other countries, and how to interpret that. And I know there's some controversy about how you measure things per person, per household, you know, whether, you know, how you actually measure sort of access and that sort of thing. The concern I have about that, it was exemplified by actually a true story when I was in Canada. And was doing a fair amount of telecom stuff. One of the hot issues at the time was 2006 was whether to deregulate local telephone service. And the Bell Canada actually sponsored a very influential report done by a consultant and an economist from New Zealand that made the following argument. Wireless penetration in Canada was near the bottom of the OECD rankings, like 21st out of 24th or something like that. And they thought, well, this is bad, it should be greater. Well, one of the reasons that wireless penetration was so low was because telephone regulation in Canada was so good and it was holding the rates down. So we need to deregulate wireline service in Canada so the rates will go up, so more people will get wireless service. And I thought, you've got to be kidding me. And it made me think, well, maybe one reason to say, one could flip these studies around and say that, that instead of Canada ranking 21st out of 24th in wireless penetration, maybe it ranks 3rd or 4th out of 24 in terms of the quality of its and price of its wireline service, and maybe that's what's going on. So that's all to say that in terms of understanding what the market failures are, understanding the rationales are, and understanding even what the data mean, that a lot of care has got to be taken.
How about in terms of rural deployment in Indiana and states like Indiana? You know, I know we hear a lot of talk about the importance, certainly the critical importance of high-speed internet access for economic development. There was a story this week here in the state. I think the initiative is telehealth, which is connecting 22 rural hospitals. $7 million initiative that was launched. Can you give some perspective on how much progress, if there is progress being made in that respect, and how the National Broadband Plan, you know, policies will affect that one way or the other in terms of rural broadband deployment?
Well, there are a few different areas. One is there's a separate pool of funds that came out of the stimulus law, and those funds have been now allocated, and they have 2 years to be spent and completed. So we literally have real dollars that have been put on the table, about $7 billion, and actually when you do the calculations, it's probably closer to 10 because a good portion of the grant money that was given by the Commerce Department, in fact all of the money, has to be leveraged by at least 20% of private or other investment. So we have, I think, a pretty good national laboratory now, and a lot of it has been in the rural development area. We have about $3 billion of money that's been loaned for rural development. So to some extent, the ship has left the port. I don't know where it's going to land eventually, but we're on that voyage now. And then the other part, clearly, is we have an enormous infrastructure that is being developed around e-health and digital medical records. We have $19 billion that were allocated in the stimulus law for e-records or electronic health records. And so when these things begin to start combine, I think to some extent these are things outside the marketplace, because these are clearly things that the government is responsible for: Medicaid reimbursement, Medicare reimbursement. And so that money is being used to essentially provide incentives for physicians and practice groups to switch over. So I think a lot of the developments that you're talking about in Indiana and elsewhere are going to be literally our test beds to see how this works. Clearly it makes sense in theory, and you know, one issue, there are a lot of issues which have nothing to do with broadband. For example, certification of physicians. If you want to do the diagnosis of someone in Illinois and if you're licensed to practice in Indiana, then you may not be able to do it according to the rules of licensure in Indiana. And so a lot of those barriers also have to fall while the technology is put in place.
Do you think it's possible that the push for electronic health records, because I know the comment was made at the